There's more to violence in Australia than just domestic and family violence. These are the stories of people who are very much loved and very much mourned, and I couldn't move forward in this space without giving their stories a voice and without acknowledging the trauma that my family experienced.
Sherele Moody, thank you for joining me. So listen, you have dedicated several years now to documenting the lives lost to violence in Australia through the Red Heart campaign. Tell me a bit about what the Red Heart campaign is.
So the Red Heart campaign is an awareness-raising project designed to highlight violent deaths in Australia and to try and get people having conversations about how we can end violence, and also to try and share the stories of people lost in violence, in particular women and children. The campaign came on the back of me doing a lot of reporting for my work with News Corp Australia on domestic and family violence. And I found that even though we were able to give voice to some of the many stories that I heard of domestic and family violence survival, we couldn't possibly publish every story. So the Red Heart campaign started as a platform to publish stories of domestic and family violence survival. It wasn't long after starting the project that I realised that there's more to violence in Australia than just domestic and family violence. And so the campaign has grown over the years to reflect that. At the moment, one of the main projects is documenting the killings of men, women and children. And there is a specific focus on the murders of women and children in Australia. The basic premise of the campaign is that we talk about violence against all Australians, regardless of perpetrator, gender or relationship to the victim. So we talk about domestic and family violence, stranger violence, associate violence. So all of those three categories. That's one of the reasons why I started it. But the other reason was because my stepfather killed two little girls, Stacey Ann Tracy, who was 9 years old, and Sandra Bacon, who was 5. And I wanted to provide a space for Stacey Ann and for Sandra to be remembered long after their families have passed on. And I also wanted that space to be an acknowledgement and memorial for other women and children lost to violence in Australia.
You worked as a journalist for many years, sharing the stories of survivors of domestic and family violence and survivors of violent crimes and their families. And then you realised that you had your own story to share. What was it like to go public with that and talk freely and publicly about this very traumatic event that had happened to you and your family?
I spent decades not talking about it. I spent decades not being able to say Stacey Ann's name aloud. And I spent decades not being able to say Sandra's name aloud, simply because I was extremely angry and very guilty about what my stepfather had did and the loss of these very young lives. And I didn't know how to process that. I didn't know how to deal with it. When I started the Red Heart campaign, I realised that if I was going to talk about the killing of women and children, then I needed to talk about the killing of Stacey Ann Tracy, and I needed to talk about the killing. I couldn't move forward in this space without giving their stories a voice, without acknowledging the trauma that their families experienced, and without acknowledging the trauma that my family experienced as a result of this man's actions. It's their families who have to live with the trauma of losing two very precious young girls who would have grown into incredible women. And, you know, I'm not the person who lost such young and vital lives, but at the very least I can repay some of the damage and maybe heal some of the heartache that my stepfather caused to Sandra and Stacey Ann's loved ones.
By kind of hosting this public platform that really, puts awareness on every single violent death that's happened, what has it shown you about violence in this country?
I mean, firstly, violence is a significant contributor to non-natural deaths in Australia. We do know that men are the primary victims of violence, but the data I collect also shows that men are the primary perpetrators of violence. It's unfortunately a sad and often inconvenient truth that Australians face when looking at this issue. We know that there are certain patterns to violence, there are certain drivers. We know that women and children are more likely to die as a result of domestic or intimate partner violence if it's women. And we also know that certain forms of violence are perpetrated, including, most people who are killed in Australia die as a result of sharp implement trauma, so stabbing, blunt instrument trauma, so bashing, and strangulation or choking. So, yeah, there are some really very sad and horrific statistics that come out of this research.
It's obviously a, relatively harrowing topic for you to involve yourself in day out. Why is it important? Why do you keep going?
I think the main reason that I keep going is because no one else is doing it, and someone has to do it. It is quite tiring at times, but I also get to work with the families of people lost to violence, and I find those families very inspirational. It's extremely rare that a family opposes the work I do, and in almost all cases, loved ones will say to me that, they want to use their person's death as a catalyst for change. And for me, that's really inspiring, that someone who's lost a person in horrific and entirely preventable circumstances is able to put their hate aside and stand up and say, I'm here to help you make change, and we'll do whatever we can to make sure that future victims are protected.
There are so many stories, almost nightly, and it's often about women and children who are falling victim to terrible acts of violence. And I think there's a human thing where we want to pull away from that because it's so awful. But in the process, what happens is that those victims often become kind of nameless and faceless. They just become a statistic. And what I thought was powerful about your work is that it's the antidote to that. It stops those people just becoming, another face that flashes across our screens on the nightly news and is then forgotten about.
That is absolutely the aim of the Red Heart campaign, and in particular the Australian Femicide and Child Death Map and the Memorial to Women and Children Lost to Violence. So those two projects contain the stories of around 2,500 women and children killed since the white settlement in Australia. It's not to say that every death has been documented, because clearly there would be tens of thousands of names on those projects. It's a very slow process doing this research and documentation. But at the end of the day, where possible, I work to name the person who's been killed. And the reality is that once their families, once a generation or two has passed away, those victims will be forgotten. They won't even be a footnote in history. And the aim of these projects is to make sure that that actually doesn't happen. That anyone in the world can jump onto either the map or the memorial and read a person's story, and if it's practical to do so, read their name. I mean, I can't name everyone. Probably a third of the deaths on the projects are unnamed for a variety of reasons, including legal reasons and cultural reasons, where in particular with Indigenous women, but also where some families don't want their loved one named, but they want them documented. And then there are just women and children on there who were never named. So, yeah, there are actually a lot of women and children who remain unnamed. And for me, that's quite a sad fact, because I think that where possible, we should be able to at least provide their name, their age, and the name of the perpetrator and the date of their death.
The survivors of violence or the families of victims, do they share their stories with you directly?
The stories come from a variety of sources. Where possible, families are involved in the process, and I try to work really closely with them, because these are the stories of people who are very much loved and very much mourned. And the stories are going to sit there for, as far as I'm concerned, for centuries, not just for years. So it's really important that we get those stories right. It's impossible to be in touch with every family, so I put the stories up, and often people will contact me and ask for changes, and I work with them on that. But in, I would say, 99% of cases where I am in touch with families, they're very supportive, and I'm very happy to have their person memorialised like this.